Welcome to Demon Sleep. I'm here to help you unwind tonight. If you enjoy this space, feel free to like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It makes this feel like a shared night across the world. These stories are different and I'm glad you're here. Dim the lights, let the room settle, and let's begin. Story 1, Locked In. The door that never opened. The stranger who introduced himself as Marcus Lane placed a worn leather case on their table. And when those brass latches snapped open, one after the other, Eric felt something cold settle in his chest. Years later, that sound would be the only thing he remembered with absolute clarity. Not the man's apologetic grin, not the excuse about car trouble or a dead phone, just that precise double-click, sharp, final, deliberate. The sound a surgeon hears before the first incision. Eric was a doctor. He knew what that sound meant. Their home had always felt modern and open. All concrete walls, sharp corners, massive windows. He'd built it that way on purpose, clean, controlled, nothing hidden. But standing there, watching rainwater drip from the stranger's coat onto their polished floor, Eric realized something he'd never considered before. This house wasn't designed for privacy. It was designed to be seen. His wife, Laura, glanced up from her reading chair with that calm, welcoming look she always wore when his colleagues dropped by unannounced. Their son, Ben, sat near the fireplace, textbooks spread around him, solving equations. The room was a flawless square, gray walls, high timber beams, glass stretching floor to ceiling on one side. Nothing soft, nothing to muffle sound. Everything exposed, everything visible. Marcus set the case down gently. The coffee table was a single piece of reclaimed wood, massive and immovable. Laura stood, offering tea, maybe a towel to dry off. That's when Eric saw it. The needle, already in the man's hand. His mind kicked into overdrive, years of training cataloging every detail in a fraction of a second. The needle was thick, too thick. The syringe held far more liquid than any standard dose, and the color, amber murky, nothing he recognized from any operating room. His body tried to respond, but it was already 2 seconds too late. Eric's brain was still catching up when Marcus stepped past Laura, who'd gone completely still, frozen in that strange way people lock up when reality breaks its own rules, and drove the needle straight into Ben's neck. The boy didn't scream. There wasn't time. Just a sharp grunt, air forced out like someone had punched him in the chest. His hand flew to his throat. He twisted toward his mother, and Eric saw it, the exact moment his son realized something catastrophic was happening inside his own body. Ben's brain was shouting commands his limbs couldn't obey. Stand, move, run. But the signals were dying somewhere in between, collapsing before they reached their destination. His hand dropped. His whole body went slack, not like someone losing consciousness, but like a building whose foundation had been pulled away in an instant. He crumpled sideways onto the concrete, one arm pinned awkwardly beneath him, his eyes still wide, still aware, staring at the textbook sliding shut beside his face. That's when Laura screamed. It was a sound Eric had never heard in nearly 2 decades together. Raw, shattered, the sound of a mind tearing itself apart trying to make sense of the impossible. She threw herself toward Ben, but Marcus was already pivoting. Eric finally broke free from his own paralysis. Not physical, but mental. The kind that locks you in place when your brain refuses to accept what your eyes are showing you. He lunged forward, knowing he was too late, knowing he'd been too late from the second. He opened the door to this man who was definitely not named Marcus Lane. The second needle caught Laura in the shoulder just as she reached Ben. She managed 3 more steps, her fingers brushing their son's hair, before her legs gave out and she went down hard beside him. Her head hit the concrete with a dull, sickening thud like something fragile dropped from too high, and Eric heard himself make a sound he didn't recognize. A moan, maybe. A whimper. The kind of sound his patients made coming out of anesthesia, lost and disoriented in a world they didn't yet understand. He froze. Marcus was staring at him now. Calm, patient, waiting. The syringe still hung in his hand, both chambers emptied. The man looked maybe 50, gaunt in that haunted way of someone who forgets meals instead of skipping them, dressed in a dark gray suit worn smooth at the elbows and a black tie that hung slightly crooked. Eric stared at the man, features so ordinary they'd vanish from memory in seconds. The kind of face you'd see on someone who spent their life working with numbers, blueprints, dosages. Neutral, calculated, trained not to give anything away. The stranger gestured toward the couch with the empty syringe, almost polite, like he was offering Eric a seat at dinner. Eric's eyes dropped to the floor. Laura and Ben were still breathing. He could see their chests lifting and falling in that mechanical rhythm he'd spent 20 years watching in surgery. Laura's eyes were open, locked on their son. Ben's were squeezed shut now, his face twisted in an expression Eric had seen 1,000 times before. A patient trying to force their body to obey, trying to move, discovering that willpower means nothing when the signals won't go through. Eric sat. The leather sighed beneath him. The fireplace kept burning its fake flames, too clean, too controlled, more decorative than real. Rain hammered the windows, but the house swallowed the sound almost completely. Another detail that suddenly made terrible sense. They'd built this place to keep noise out. Or in. Marcus settled into the chair across from him, placing the empty syringe back into the case with an unsettling gentleness, like it was something precious. Then he pulled out another one, this one still sealed. The liquid inside was clear as water. Vecuronium, Marcus said quietly. The word hit Eric like a fist. He knew exactly what it was. A paralytic. The kind that shuts down every voluntary muscle in your body while leaving your mind fully awake. He'd used it countless times, watched it erase movement, speech, even the ability to breathe on your own, all while the patient remained completely conscious. It was designed for surgery, for control. Marcus kept talking, his voice calm and factual, explaining dosage, timing, how it worked. Eric already knew. He'd memorized this in medical school, had injected it into patients for 2 decades. Standard dose meant 45 minutes of total paralysis. Everything locked, breathing still automatic but nothing else. No movement, no words, not even the ability to blink a message for help. Eric's mouth went bone dry. His breathing quickened, shallow and erratic. His body was gearing up for a fight it had no idea how to win. Eric's gaze kept drifting back to them. Laura and Ben, motionless on the cold floor. Laura's eyes hadn't closed. They were still locked on their son with a fierce, desperate intensity, as if she believed she could move her body through sheer force of love. My wife's name was Rachel. Marcus let the words hang in the air. Sacred Heart Medical Center, March 14, 2019. Simple gallbladder removal, should have been routine. The date didn't register at first. March 2019 was over 6 years ago. Hundreds of surgeries. A blur of faces and procedures Eric had deliberately buried in the back of his mind. But then something shifted, a cold, sinking feeling in his gut. Because there was one surgery from that year he couldn't forget. One patient whose death had triggered an investigation, a settlement with the family, and a 3-month suspension that nearly ended his career. Marcus kept talking, his voice still calm, but now there was something underneath it, something sharp and contained. Rage so controlled it had crystallized into something almost serene. He described what happened to his wife in brutal, clinical detail. She woke up during the surgery. The paralytic was still active, locking her body in place while the sedative wore off too quickly. For 47 minutes she was fully conscious, fully aware. She felt the first incision, felt them cutting deeper, felt every movement inside her body, every burn from the cauterization tools. Couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't signal for help. The autopsy showed her heart gave out from the terror itself, not from surgical error, from fear so extreme her body couldn't survive it. Eric's stomach turned. He remembered. He'd been drinking that day. Not obviously, he'd always been careful about that, but enough. Enough that his calculations were just slightly off. He'd miscalculated the sedative dose for a woman whose body processed it faster than normal. And he'd missed the signs, the elevated heart rate, the subtle spikes in blood pressure, all the indicators that she was awake. Because he'd been distracted, thinking about the fight he'd had with Laura that morning, about Ben's grade slipping, about everything except the woman on the table who was silently screaming inside a body that wouldn't respond. The hospital investigation came back inconclusive. These things happen sometimes. Anesthesia awareness is rare but documented. The dosage had been within acceptable limits. No way to predict how her body would react. No gross negligence. But Eric knew. He'd known then, and he knew now, sitting in his own home while his family lay frozen on the floor, that he'd killed Rachel through carelessness, through impairment, through his own failure to pay attention. Marcus placed the syringe down carefully. Marcus set the capped syringe on the table between them. Then his hand slipped inside his jacket and emerged with a revolver, dark metal, worn smooth with age, maybe something passed down through generations. He laid it beside the syringe with the same careful precision. "What's inside here," Marcus said, tapping the syringe with one finger, "is something I've been working on for 6 years. I used to do pharmaceutical research before Rachel died. After, I dedicated myself to studying pain, how it works, how the nervous system processes it, how to create it." He lifted the syringe, holding it up to the firelight. The liquid inside caught the glow, casting fractured shadows across the concrete walls. "This compound targets TRPV1 receptors, the same ones that respond to heat, to capsaicin, to the feeling of being burned. But it doesn't actually damage tissue. It just convinces your nervous system that your body is on fire, that your skin is melting, that you're being consumed by flames." Eric's stomach lurched. He swallowed hard, tasting metal and bile. "I've already injected your wife and son with this," Marcus continued, his voice still flat, still calm, like he was reading test results from a clipboard. "Along with the paralytic. Right now, they're feeling what it's like to burn alive. Every nerve is screaming, but they can't scream, can't move, can't do anything but feel it." Eric's eyes snapped to Laura. Her gaze had shifted. She was staring at him now with an expression he couldn't decipher. Was that pain, pure terror, or was it just the empty look of someone whose face no longer obeyed their mind? Ben's eyes were still shut, but Eric could see his jaw clenching and releasing in an uneven rhythm. Maybe he was trying to bite down against the agony, or maybe it was nothing, just random muscle twitches in a system that had been shut down. "The compound clears slowly," Marcus said. "Takes about 6 hours to fully metabolize. 6 hours of feeling your skin blister and peel. of experiencing pain so extreme the human brain shouldn't be able to process it without shutting down. Except it can't shut down. There's no real injury, no shock, no blackout, just pain, pure, uninterrupted pain, for 6 hours. He gestured toward the gun. But I'm not cruel. There's one bullet in the chamber. You can use it. To end it for one of them. One round. One act of mercy. The other endures all 6 hours. Eric stared at the weapon. Dark steel. Wooden handle polished smooth from years of use. You have to decide, Marcus said softly. Your wife or your son? Who do you love enough to save from this? Who do you love so little that you let them burn? The words settled over the room like ash. Eric's hearing sharpened. The rain outside, it was louder now, every drop distinct against the glass. The fireplace hissed quietly. He could hear Laura breathing, Ben breathing, his own breath shallow and uneven. All of them still alive, still here, still in the seconds before a decision became permanent. He turned to Laura. Her eyes weren't on him. They were locked on Ben. Even through the paralysis, something burned in that gaze, something primal and absolute. A message he'd seen before. Save him. Whatever it costs me, save him. He'd seen that exact look 17 years ago in the delivery room. When Ben was born and Laura started hemorrhaging and the doctor was shouting orders and someone said they might lose her. She'd looked at Eric then with that same fierce, unbreakable clarity, and he'd understood without a single word spoken. She would trade her life for the babies in a heartbeat. It wasn't even a choice for her. It was simply how the world worked. Ben's eyes opened. The boy was staring at him now, and Eric saw pure, undiluted terror reflected back. The kind of fear that only exists in nightmares or in the final moments before death. But was it the pain causing that look? Or was it seeing his father's hand moving toward the gun? Eric's hand was already moving. He hadn't told it to. The decision was forming somewhere deeper than thought, somewhere instinctual, where years of training lived, where muscle memory took over, where the reflex to stop suffering overrode everything else. His fingers brushed the grip. The metal was freezing, colder than the room, colder than anything around it, like touching something that didn't belong in this world, something that carried its own darkness. He picked it up. It felt wrong, too light, like the universe was mocking him by making this unbearable choice feel easy in his hand. His fingers trembled. The gun shook in his grip. The barrel traced invisible patterns in the air, swinging between Laura and Ben like a compass needle that couldn't find north. Numbers, that's all this was, an equation to solve. Laura was 43. Ben was 17. She'd lived a full life, marriage, career, motherhood, travel, heartbreak, joy. Ben had barely scratched the surface. High school chemistry, a few awkward dates, the narrow tunnel of teenage life that hadn't yet opened into the vast possibilities waiting on the other side. If this was just cold math, who had more future to lose, the answer was clear. But there was another calculation. Laura was tougher. She'd survived childbirth, watched her father waste away from cancer, endured the years of Eric's drinking, the lies he'd told, the ways he'd failed her over and over. She had strength Ben hadn't needed to build yet. If the burning was real and Eric had no way to verify that, no way to know except by reading faces frozen into masks that could mean anything or nothing, then maybe Laura could survive it. Maybe she could carry that trauma and keep moving forward. Ben might shatter under it. 6 hours of feeling his body consumed by fire could destroy him completely, leave him broken in ways that never heal. Then there was the third equation. The one Eric didn't want to look at. but it forced itself forward like a diagnosis he couldn't ignore. This was his fault. Rachel's death, this nightmare, all of it traced back to his drinking, his carelessness, his failure to stay focused when someone's life depended on him. If anyone deserved to pay for what he'd done, it was him. But he wasn't being offered as an option. Marcus wanted something different. He wanted Eric to suffer by choosing, by living with the knowledge that he'd condemned someone he loved to agony, wanted him to carry that weight for the rest of his life. Unless... Eric's eyes shifted to Marcus. The man sat perfectly still, watching with that same detached expression, like a scientist observing an experiment, recording data. There was no other weapon visible, just the gun in Eric's hand. If Eric turned it on Marcus instead, pulled the trigger, ended this, he could call for help. Get Laura and Ben to the hospital, reverse the paralytic, save them both. But the math collapsed. Even if Eric shot Marcus right now, ended this, Laura and Ben would stay frozen during the ambulance ride, through the emergency room intake, through the time it took doctors to figure out what drug was in their system and how to reverse it. 20 minutes at best, an hour at worst. And if Marcus was telling the truth about the pain compound, if they really were burning right now, then every additional minute was another minute of hell. The bullet meant instant relief. Shooting Marcus meant dragging out the unknown. And if Eric pulled the trigger and Marcus was lying, if there was no pain compound, if Laura and Ben were just paralyzed and terrified but not actually suffering, then Eric would have murdered someone, would have proven Marcus right, would have become exactly what this man accused him of being. A killer. The gun stayed in his hand. His finger rested on the trigger. The weight of the decision was replacing his blood with lead, draining the oxygen from his lungs with something thick and useless. His head felt light. The room sounded different now, muffled, distant, like he was trapped inside glass. Owen was still staring at him. Eric searched his son's face desperately, trying to read what was there. Pain, terror, a silent plea, but paralyzed faces gave nothing away. They were blank canvases, mirrors. They only showed what you brought to them. Then he saw it. A single tear sliding from the corner of Laura's eye, tracing down her temple, pooling in the hollow behind her ear. Something cracked inside Eric's chest. The pain was real. She was crying, not from fear, from agony, from the feeling of her skin blistering and peeling, from suffering so complete that tears were the only thing her body could still produce. The tear was proof. Laura's eyes closed, or maybe she forced them shut. Maybe she had just enough control left to refuse to watch what came next, to retreat somewhere inside herself where this wasn't happening. Eric envied her that. He wanted to close his own eyes, wanted to disappear, wanted to wake up in some other version of reality where he hadn't been drinking that day in March 2019, where Rachel survived her surgery and went home and lived a long, ordinary life, arguing with her husband about bills and vacation plans and growing old together. But that reality didn't exist. This was the only one he had. The one where mistakes compounded, where sins piled up until they became something monstrous, where every path led somewhere unbearable. Eric stood. His body felt disconnected, like he was watching himself move from somewhere far away. He crossed the room to where Ben lay motionless on the floor, knelt down beside him. Up close he could see everything. Ben's pupils blown wide, a thin trail of spit running from his mouth to the concrete, his pulse hammering in his throat, way too fast. The kind of elevated heart rate that signaled either extreme pain or absolute terror. The gun felt impossibly heavy now. Eric positioned himself beside his son. Ben's eyes followed the movement, tracked the weapon as Eric lifted it, as his trembling hand steadied with that eerie calm that sometimes arrives when the decision has already been made and all that's left is following through. 17 years. Eric had been there when Ben was born, cut the cord with hands shaking from wonder and fear, held him through those first sleepless nights when the baby screamed with colic, packing the living room at 3 in the morning while Laura slept the deep, exhausted sleep of new mothers. Taught him to ride a bike in an empty parking lot on a Sunday, running alongside him with one hand on the seat, holding on until the moment came to let go. Been at every game, every school event, every milestone. Failed him in 1,000 quiet ways, the impatience, the distraction, the drinking that Eric thought was secret but that Ben almost certainly knew about, and loved him in 1,000 bigger ways that Eric had never been able to put into words. And now this. The barrel pressed against Ben's temple. The boy's eyes stayed wide, unblinking. The paralytic made even that small reflex impossible. Eric could see his own reflection in Ben's eye, could see the warped image of a man holding a gun to his son's head, could see the thing he'd become. "I'm sorry," Eric whispered. The words came out shattered, wrapped in breath that tasted like bile and shame. "I'm so sorry, I'm saving you. You understand that, right? I'm ending the pain. 6 hours of burning. I can't let you go through that. I can't." He was convincing himself as much as Ben, building the story that would let him pull the trigger. Laura could survive this. Laura was strong. She'd already made the choice herself, communicated it with that look before her eyes closed, told him without words to save their son, to let her endure anything if it meant Ben was spared. The trigger had almost no resistance, smooth, easy. Eric had fired guns before, went to ranges with colleagues who thought doctors should know how to handle weapons for home protection. He knew the basics, how to aim, how to control his breathing, how to squeeze instead of pulling, how to absorb the kickback. His finger tightened. The math was simple. Ben's chances of surviving 6 hours of perceived immolation without permanent psychological destruction, nearly zero. The certainty of death from a bullet fired at point-blank range into the skull, nearly absolute. The equation solved itself. The trigger moved. The firing pin dropped. The world collapsed into a single instant that could never be undone, never rewritten, never forgiven or forgotten or explained away. The gunshot was deafening. In the concrete room with its perfect acoustics, the sound didn't just echo, it multiplied, bounced between walls, built on itself, created a sustained roar that seemed to contain every thunderstorm that had ever existed, compressed into one irreversible moment of violence. Ben's head jerked sideways. A fine red mist appeared on the wall, tiny droplets that looked almost delicate, almost deliberate, like something intentional instead of the accidental result of a father's love expressed in the worst way possible. The boy's eyes stayed open. Eric watched the light fade from them, watched the spark die, watched his son stop being his son and become just a body, become evidence of something Eric would never be able to categorize, crime or mercy, murder or salvation. The gun slipped from his hand. It hit the floor with a sharp, final sound, like punctuation, like the end of a sentence, marking the division between the world that existed 3 seconds ago and the world that existed now. Sounds came from Eric's throat. Not words, just noise. The kind of raw, animal sounds that escape when language breaks down completely, when grief is too new to have shape or structure. Footsteps. Marcus was moving. Eric registered it distantly, the way a drowning person notices boats passing overhead but can't summon the strength to signal for help. He watched Marcus kneel beside Laura, watched him prepare another syringe, this one filled with amber liquid. Some detached part of Eric's brain identified it automatically, neostigmine, the reversal agent. Marcus injected it with the same careful precision he'd shown throughout. Then he stood, turned, and walked to where Eric knelt over Ben's body. He glanced at his watch like someone timing an experiment. There was no pain compound, Marcus said. The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds, syllables. Then they became language. Then they became information. Then they became the thing that shattered whatever was left of Eric's world. The second injection was saline, Marcus continued in that same flat, clinical tone. Sterile water, completely harmless. Your wife and son weren't experiencing anything except paralysis. No pain, no burning, they were fine. Terrified, yes. Unable to move, yes, but fine. Eric stared at him. His brain was trying to process the words, but something had broken. The normal pathways from understanding to reaction weren't working anymore. The terror you saw in their eyes, Marcus said, wasn't from agony. It was from watching you hold that gun, from seeing you decide, from knowing one of them was about to die and not knowing which one, and not being able to speak or scream or beg or do anything except wait to see where you aimed. Eric looked down at Ben, at the small, precise hole in his temple, at the stillness that was nothing like paralysis, absolute, permanent. You killed your son, Marcus said, because you believed he was suffering, because your guilt over my wife made you see pain that wasn't there, because you thought you were being kind. Behind them, a sound. Laura gasped her first breath under her own control in 15 minutes. The reversal agent was kicking in, unlocking her neuromuscular system. Eric heard her trying to move, heard her hands scrape against the floor as function slowly returned, heard her breathing quicken as she fought through the lingering paralysis. Marcus walked to the door, pulled it open. Rain and freezing air poured in, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine. He paused in the doorway, looking back at Eric kneeling beside Ben's body, at Laura starting to move, her eyes still shut, or maybe newly closed, refusing to see what had been done. You asked me why, Marcus said. That's why. So you know what it feels like to be the one who causes suffering through your own mistakes, to be the one who makes the wrong choice, to be the one who has to live with it afterward. He stepped into the rain. The door stayed open. Darkness and cold and weather spilled into the concrete room where Eric knelt with his hands on his dead son's chest, searching for a pulse that he knew wasn't there, checking out of habit, out of training, out of some desperate, impossible hope that reality might bend just this once, that the universe might rewind these last 5 minutes. Let him choose differently. Let him turn the gun on Marcus instead. Let him refuse entirely. Let him do anything except what he'd done. A hand closed weakly around his ankle. Laura, her grip was faint but growing stronger as the drug cleared her system. She was pulling herself forward, toward Owen, toward the sound of Eric's breathing, toward the unbearable silence where their son's voice should have been. Her eyes opened. Eric watched her see Owen's body, see the gun on the floor, see the blood streaked across the wall, watched understanding wash over her face like a wave, like darkness falling. Except this darkness wouldn't lift, ever. The sound she made would live inside Eric for the rest of his life, in the gaps between heartbeats, in the quiet before sleep. In every moment he caught his reflection and saw a killer staring back. It was the sound of a mother realizing her child is dead, and that the person she loved, the person she trusted, built a life with, was the one who killed him. The rain kept falling. The fireplace kept burning its fake flames. The concrete walls held every sound perfectly. Laura's grief, Eric's ragged breathing, the absence of Owen's heartbeat amplifying them, making them permanent in the architecture of their collapsing world. Outside, Marcus's footsteps faded into the storm. Inside, Laura dragged herself fully to Owen's body, wrapped her arms around him, pressed her face to his chest. Her body convulsed with sobs that sounded like drowning, like someone trying to expel water from their lungs. Except what she was trying to expel wasn't water. It was knowledge. The unbearable truth that some things can't be cried out or purged or expelled from the system. Eric stayed kneeling. He could stand. He could move. This paralysis was voluntary, chosen, the only choice he had left now. He could reach for Laura, could try to explain, could offer comfort or apology or justification. But those gestures belonged to a world where his actions hadn't obliterated every bond that once connected them, where the word sorry still meant something, where touch was still allowed between people who used to love each other. The revolver lay on the concrete where he dropped it. One round fired, 5 chambers empty, enough for one more choice, if choice still mattered. If anything he did now could change or fix or repair the fundamental break he'd caused in the fabric of reality. But he didn't reach for it. He stayed kneeling beside his son's body while his wife held the boy and wept and refused to meet his eyes. While the rain hammered against glass and the fireplace flickered and the concrete walls captured and echoed and preserved every sound, every breath, every moment of this new reality he'd built with love and guilt, and the catastrophic math of trying to decide which suffering was acceptable and which was not. He'd wanted to save his son from agony, wanted to be merciful, wanted to finally be the father he'd never quite managed to be when Owen was alive and the stakes were smaller and the failures were ordinary. And he'd succeeded. Owen felt no pain now. Owen felt nothing at all. The mercy was total, absolute, forever. Eric closed his eyes and waited for Laura to speak, knowing she wouldn't, knowing that silence was the only language they shared now, knowing he would spend whatever time he had left in exactly this position, kneeling beside the result of his choice, waiting for forgiveness that would never arrive. Listening to the rain, the fire, the sound of his wife's shattering grief. Trying to calculate when the scales would balance, when the debt would be settled, when he'd finally be allowed to stop existing in the exact moment. He pulled the trigger and learned that mercy and murder were the same word, just spoken with different weight. Story 2-4 went down. Only one stayed behind. Joel had no idea how long they'd been walking in circles. 4 days, maybe. That's what his gut told him. But the others were starting to argue loudly, desperately, and somewhere deep down, he was beginning to think they might be right. That his sense of time had broken down just like Garrett's compass, the one he claimed fell into that ravine on day 1. If it even was day 1. The forest didn't let sunlight through. Just this strange, flat grayness that filtered down through the tangled canopy overhead. It never got brighter, never got darker. Morning and evening bled together into one endless, unchanging twilight. And that sameness, That relentless, suffocating sameness was messing with Joel's head worse than the gnawing hunger in his stomach or the dry rasp in his throat. They still had a little water left. Not much, but enough. At least they had. The cache they'd hidden near that massive granite rock, gone, vanished overnight. That's when everything started falling apart. Trevor had. Joel didn't know how long they'd been lost anymore. 4 days. That was his best guess. But the others were pushing back harder now, their voices edged with something sharp and desperate. And deep down, Joel was starting to wonder if they were right. If his internal clock had stopped working the same way Garrett's compass had, the one he swore he'd dropped into that ravine on the first afternoon. If there even was a first afternoon. The forest refused to let the sun in. Just this pale, lifeless glow seeping through the ceiling of twisted branches overhead. It never brightened, never faded. Day and night didn't exist here, just one long, unbroken stretch of gray sameness. And that was the worst part. Worse than the hunger clawing at his gut. Worse than the thirst starting to crack his lips. They'd had water, stashed it near that enormous boulder, but when they went back for it, it was gone. Just gone. That's when the accusation started. Trevor had stopped mapping constellations in his little notebook after the first night. Couldn't see the sky anymore. Claire had stopped humming that old folk tune her grandmother taught her, probably around day 2, if Joel's memory could be trusted anymore. But the silence she left behind felt ancient, like it had always been there. The ravine announced itself before they saw it. A shift in the air, a hollow quality to the sound, like the wind was moving over something deep and empty. Joel raised his hand. The others stopped behind him. He could hear their breathing in the thick, muffled quiet that pressed down on this place. This forest that didn't feel like any forest Joel had walked through in 30 years of hiking. It felt wrong, deliberately wrong, like it existed to break all the rules. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. The trees themselves, some kind of pine Joel couldn't identify despite knowing his trees grew at angles that shouldn't be possible. Their trunks curved gently, like the ground had shifted beneath them while they were growing, then shifted back, then shifted again. "We've been here before," Garrett said behind him. His voice carried that mix of blame and defeat that had crept into everything he said since the water disappeared. Claire nodded, but Joel noticed she was standing several feet away from Garrett now. Not beside him like she had those first few days, before the argument started, before they began sleeping in shifts to stop whoever was sabotaging them. They still didn't know who. The ravine stretched out in front of them, exactly like before. A jagged tear in the earth about 40 feet across, its far side lost in the fog that pooled everywhere at ankle height. The rope they'd tied to a thick root still hung over the edge, its frayed end swaying slightly. That rope used to be longer. They tried to descend on the first attempt, lost everything, the packs with their food, the emergency radio, the maps that might have explained where the hell they were. All of it vanished into that gray void. No sound when it hit bottom, no echo. Trevor hadn't spoken since they found the rope cut. He stood at the ravine's edge now, staring down into the fog with an intensity that made Joel's skin crawl. His shoulders were locked tight beneath his torn jacket, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Trevor used to laugh, all the time. He'd tell these long, winding stories about his work studying ocean life, kept a little leather journal where he'd sketch tide patterns from memory whenever they stopped to rest. But that version of Trevor was gone now, lost with everything else. What stood at the ravine's edge was something different, something hollow, and when he looked at Joel, there was something dark in his eyes, something close to hate. Joel had no idea what he'd done to deserve it. "We need to back away from the edge," Joel said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the mounting certainty pressing against his ribs. The feeling that something was guiding them, pushing them in circles, watching them struggle and finding it entertaining. The Starman might be watching. The effect was immediate. Claire's face drained of color. She turned and moved quickly toward the trees. Garrett's head snapped up, scanning the gaps in the canopy, searching for that burning face that had been appearing more and more often lately. Since day 3 or day 4, maybe day 2. Joel couldn't remember anymore. The timeline had fractured in his mind, though he tried to keep track of every encounter, every narrow escape. The first time they saw the Starman was after dark. Joel was certain it was their second night. Garrett swore it was the first. Claire claimed she'd heard its voice even before the ravine incident, which would mean it had been following them longer than any of them wanted to admit. The thing had a head like a flare, blinding white light. Looking directly at it felt like staring into a welding torch. And when it spoke, it only said their names. Never threats, never demands, just their names over and over in this grinding, mechanical voice that made the trees around them vibrate with a frequency that turned Joel's stomach and scrambled his sense of balance. Joel had a theory. The Starman fed on confusion. It wanted them disoriented, herded them like livestock, and it was driving them slowly and deliberately toward the ravine. For reasons Joel didn't want to think about. They'd learned how to survive it, at least. Joel figured out early on that the thing couldn't see through thick brush. If they pressed themselves flat against the ground and held their breath, its searching light would sweep over them harmlessly. That trick had saved them at least 3 times now. Maybe more. At first, the others hadn't. Believed him, especially Garrett. He wanted to talk to the Starman, thought they could reason with it. Then Garrett stood up during one of its searches, waved his arms, nearly got caught in that scorching light. After that, they listened to Joel, at least when it came to hiding. But the sabotage, that was still happening. Someone was methodically dismantling their chances of getting out. The water was just the start. A couple days later, or maybe it was the same day, time had stopped making sense by then. Joel found his compass. Smashed, crushed under a rock, the glass face spiderwebbed, the needle bent at a vicious angle. Not an accident. He'd confronted them. They'd all stood there in a loose circle, staring at the broken instrument, and the accusations started flying. Everyone denied it. Everyone hinted, some more subtly than others, that someone else had cracked, gone mad, turned malicious. "Someone's helping it," Claire had said quietly. "Helping the Starman." Joel had shut that down immediately, called it paranoia, but he couldn't shake it. Couldn't stop himself from watching them when they thought he was asleep, searching for any sign that one of them was working with that thing. They walked in single file now, Joel in front always, the others trailing behind at wider and wider intervals as whatever trust they'd had dissolved. The fog that hung over the ravine was spreading, creeping between the trees, cutting visibility down to maybe 20 feet. Joel felt the panic rising in his chest, that tight, breathless feeling he'd become familiar with. But he pushed it down, buried it. He had to look calm, had to look like he knew what he was doing, even as everything inside him unraveled. A smell rose from the fog, thick, organic, like freshly turned earth, like something that had been buried and then dug up again. Joel told himself it was just the forest, decomposition, natural decay. His head throbbed. That was new. The pain had started sometime after they found the rope cut. A dull pressure behind his eyes that got worse when he tried to remember specifics about the first day, about how they'd ended up here, about whether they'd filed their hiking plan with the ranger station like they were supposed to. Those memories should have been crystal clear. You don't forget whether you filed a route plan with the rangers, but when Joel tried to pull them up, there was nothing, just fog. The same gray emptiness filling the ravine, like it was leaking into his brain. His hands caught his attention. Dirt caked deep under his fingernails, the kind of grime that only comes from digging, from prolonged contact with soil. But he couldn't remember doing anything that would have left his hands like this. He rubbed his fingers together. The dirt released that same earthy smell from the fog, and something else underneath, something sweeter, concentrated, unmistakable. Garrett broke the silence. They'd stopped to rest under a cluster of trees that looked disturbingly familiar to Joel, though he couldn't say if they'd been here an hour ago or 3 days ago, if they were walking in circles, or if the forest just repeated itself endlessly. "We need to talk about the food situation," Garrett said. Trevor spoke for the first time since morning. If it even was morning, his voice came out rough and unused. "There is no food," he said flatly. "We all know that, so why talk about it?" Garrett's jaw tightened. "The packs went over, fine, but we had trail mix in our pockets. I had a whole bag of almonds. They're gone." It was true. Joel had checked his pockets over and over, found nothing except the small knife clipped to his belt. The one with the blade snapped clean in half. He had a dim, fractured memory of cutting something, sawing frantically at something tough and resistant while the Star Man's light swept through the trees around him. But it felt like a dream, hazy, incomplete. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Didn't want to seem unreliable. "Maybe we ate it and forgot," Claire offered quietly. But even she didn't sound convinced. Joel saw her glance toward Trevor with an expression he couldn't quite read. Suspicion, fear. The line between the two had blurred. Joel reached out to touch her shoulder, just a reassuring gesture, something to hold the group together. Her jacket felt wrong under his palm. Stiff, cold, colder than it should have been, even in the damp chill of the forest. She didn't react, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him at all. Joel pulled his hand back quickly, a sick feeling crawling up his spine. Something was off. He couldn't name it, but he felt it. They kept arguing, accusations flying back and forth in the same tired loops. And somewhere in the middle of it, Joel stopped being able to tell who was talking. The voices started bleeding together, overlapping, until they didn't sound like three separate people anymore. They sounded like one voice split into different tones. One voice that seemed to originate somewhere deep inside Joel's own skull and echo outward into the gray space between them. He should have been terrified by that realization. Instead, he felt something close to relief, like some hidden truth about their situation had finally surfaced, even if he couldn't quite grasp what it meant. The argument died the second they heard it. The grinding. It came from the south, or what they'd been calling south since the compass broke. A metallic scraping sound, like heavy machinery dragging through the forest. And beneath it, faint but unmistakable, Joel heard his name. Not shouted, not screamed. Spoken with mechanical precision. "Joel." A pause. "Joel." "DOWN," Joel barked. They hit the ground instantly. flattened themselves into the undergrowth, pressed against the cold, wet earth the way they'd learned to, the way they'd been forced to learn. The light came seconds later, blinding, white-hot, cutting through the trees overhead like a blade, throwing the canopy into sharp, unnatural relief. The shadows it cast moved wrong, fluid, almost liquid, like the light had weight and was physically shoving the darkness aside instead of just passing through it. Joel could feel the others beside him, bodies locked tight with fear, breathing shallow and controlled. The beam swept over them, searching. And with it came that voice again, that grinding, automated voice calling their names, all of them now, one by one, like it was hurting them, like it believed it had every right to summon them. The light stopped directly above. Joel's skin prickled with heat, actual heat, radiating down through the branches, in a forest that had been freezing since they arrived. He pressed himself deeper into the rot and mud, trying to merge with the ground, trying to vanish completely from whatever was watching them. The light stayed. Too long. Way too long. Then finally it moved. Swept east toward the ravine. The grinding voice faded with it. But Joel knew. This wasn't over. It never was. The thing always came back, always circled, kept hunting them with endless patience until it pushed them exactly where it wanted them, until they made whatever mistake it was waiting for. They stayed frozen on the ground long after the light vanished. No one wanted to move first, to break whatever fragile protection their stillness had given them. Eventually Joel stood, brushing mud and dead leaves off his jacket. The others rose slowly after him, their faces hollowed out by exhaustion and fear. Claire was crying, silent tears cutting tracks through the grime on her face. Garrett's hands were shaking, a fine tremor that spread up his arms and into his shoulders. Only Trevor looked calm, his expression empty, his eyes fixed on something between the trees that Joel couldn't see. They had to move. Joel knew that with absolute certainty. Staying in one place too long was suicide. The Starman circled back, always, and if they didn't keep moving, it would find them. But which way? They tried every direction, every route, and it always ended the same. Always brought them back to the ravine, back to that edge, staring down into fog that never revealed what was at the bottom. A thought pushed its way into Joel's mind, unwanted, persistent. Maybe they weren't supposed to leave. Maybe the forest had already claimed them, swallowed them whole, and what they were experiencing now wasn't captivity, it was conversion. A slow transformation from human beings into something else, something that belonged here in ways they couldn't yet understand. Joel shoved the thought away hard. That kind of thinking led nowhere good, led to giving up, and he had a responsibility to the others, to keep them moving, to lead even when leading felt pointless. They started walking again. Joel had no idea which direction they were going, no confidence left in any choice he made. The trees closed in around them, trunks still bent at those wrong angles, branches woven overhead in patterns too deliberate to be natural. The fog had gotten worse while they were hiding, risen from their ankles to their knees. Joel felt like he was wading through shallow water, each step creating small ripples that hung in the air too long before fatting. Trevor had fallen behind. Joel only noticed gradually, realized with a jolt that he couldn't hear Trevor's footsteps anymore, couldn't feel his presence in the group. Joel turned around. Trevor was standing about 20 feet back, completely still, staring down at something on the ground. Joel walked back to him. The others followed, slow and reluctant. He looked down at what had frozen Trevor in place. A section of disturbed earth, fresh soil turned over in a crude rectangle, about 6 feet long, 3 feet wide. The shape was unmistakable. A grave. Someone had dug a grave in the middle of the forest. Joel's throat closed up. The others gathered around, silent. Their faces mirrored the sick horror crawling through Joel's chest. The dirt was fresh, the work recent, maybe done in the last few hours. But by who? They were alone, hadn't seen another person since day one. Just trees and fog and that burning thing hunting them through the dark. Garrett dropped to his knees beside it. His hands hovered over the soil like he wanted to touch it, but couldn't make himself do it. He started to speak. Who could have? His voice broke. The question died. Joel's brain scrambled for answers, for any explanation that made sense. Had they walked past this spot before and missed it somehow? Was the grave already here, hidden under the fog, only visible now because of some shift in the forest? No. The earth was too fresh, the edges too clean. This was new. Which meant someone had dug this while they were hiding from the Starman, worked in near total silence, knew exactly where to find them, and left this here as a message. Because that's what it was. Joel was certain. A message meant specifically for them. He just didn't know what it was trying to say. Trevor stood up suddenly and started walking. Fast, almost running. Trevor, Joel shouted after him. No response. They chased him, fighting to keep him in sight through the thickening fog. Joel's panic spiked as Trevor's figure pulled farther ahead, moving faster than any person should be able to, like the forest itself was dragging him away. Garrett grabbed Joel's arm to keep him from tripping over a root. And Joel felt it again. That wrongness. Garrett's hand was freezing, impossibly cold. The fingers locked stiff. Not from cold, from something else, like a body in rigor mortis. But the thought slipped away before Joel could hold on to it. Just another symptom of exhaustion, of fear wearing him down. Trevor stopped. He stood in front of another cluster of trees arranged in a rough circle. As Joel got closer, he saw what had frozen Trevor in place. More graves. 3 of them lined up in a perfect row, same dimensions, same fresh dirt. The soil beside them showed marks, scratches, and indents like someone had used a flat rock or a piece of wood to move the earth. Slowly, methodically. Joel stared down at the graves, and something cold and terrible started building in his chest. His hands throbbed, blisters that had burst and reformed. His shoulders ached with the deep, persistent soreness that came from repetitive digging motions. He looked down at his palms. They were caked in the same dirt that surrounded the graves, his fingernails packed black with it, evidence of work he had no memory doing. No. Joel turned to the others, desperate for answers, for someone to tell him this made sense. But all he found was his own confusion staring back at him, multiplied, amplified. And when he really looked at them, when he forced himself to see what he'd been avoiding since the beginning, he saw it. Claire's skin had a grayish tint that matched the fog. Garrett's eyes were clouded with something that wasn't moisture. Trevor stood with an unnatural stillness, not resting, just absent, like there was nothing animating him anymore. The smell got stronger, rising from the ground, from the air, from them. That earthy, organic smell of soil and rot, and things decomposing in the dark. "We need to leave," Claire whispered. "We need to get as far from here as possible." Garrett shook his head. "No, we need to understand what's happening. We need to dig one up, see what's underneath." As he spoke, Joel felt certainty crystallizing inside him, a terrible knowledge trying to surface, trying to be born, but something in his mind was holding it back, keeping it locked down where it couldn't destroy him. The argument between Garrett and Claire escalated, their voices rising despite the danger, despite knowing the Star Man might hear. And Joel found himself paralyzed, couldn't intervene, couldn't speak or even move. His eyes locked on those 3 graves lined up in perfect formation. 3 graves, 4 hikers. The math was simple, the meaning wasn't. Then the grinding started again. Closer this time, close enough that Joel could hear actual words beneath the mechanical distortion. His name, yes, but other things too. Words that sounded like coordinates, like location, like respond. Words that sounded less like a threat and more like communication. Which made no sense, not with how the Star Man had been hunting them, hurting them, driving them toward the ravine with relentless intent. They ran. Joel didn't give the order. They just moved, away from the graves, away from the approaching light, deeper into the forest where the trees pressed in tight and the fog climbed to chest height. Visibility dropped to an arm's length. One wrong turn and they'd lose each other completely. Joel could hear them behind him, panicked breathing, stumbling footsteps, and beneath it all, that grinding voice still calling his name with mechanical, patient repetition. The ravine appeared out of nowhere. Joel's foot hit the edge and there was nothing beneath it. His arms flailed, his body tilted forward. The others slammed into him from behind. For one awful, suspended moment, they were a tangled mass of limbs teetering at the drop, about to fall. Then the weight shifted. They collapsed backward onto solid ground in a heap. Joel lay on his back, chest heaving, staring up through the canopy at the gray void beyond. The Star Man's light swept overhead. Its beam sliced through the branches. Joel squeezed his eyes shut against the brilliance, against that voice speaking his name with horrible, mechanical clarity. When he opened his eyes, the light was gone. He sat up slowly, checked himself, scraped palms, bruised knees, but nothing broken. He looked around for the others. Claire sat with her head between her knees. Garrett lay on his side, groaning. Trevor. Trevor was gone. "Trevor," Joel called. Nothing. He stood searching the fog, listening for any sound, any sign. Just the forest smothering silence, and the distant grinding voice that wouldn't stop. Claire lifted her head. Her face was blank, empty. "He went over," she said flatly. "When we fell, he couldn't stop himself. He went over the edge." Joel stared at her. That should have triggered something. Panic, grief, something. But Joel didn't move. Didn't rush to the edge to look for Trevor. Didn't try to help. Instead, he stood there, frozen, picking apart Claire's words, looking for the crack, the lie he knew was there. Because Trevor hadn't screamed. If he'd really fallen into the ravine, he would have screamed, made some sound, given some indication he was going over. But there'd been nothing, just the chaos of their near fall, then silence. "We have to look for him," Garrett said. But he didn't stand, didn't make any move to start searching. And Joel understood instantly Garrett didn't believe his own words. He was just going through the motions, playing the part of someone who cared. Joel walked to the ravine's edge and stared down. The fog had climbed higher. It swallowed everything below the first few feet. He called Trevor's name into that gray emptiness. No answer, no echo, nothing. The ravine consumed sound as completely as it had consumed their gear, their food, their hope. Joel turned back. The others were watching him with expressions he couldn't read anymore. Expectation, maybe, or judgment, or fear. He couldn't tell the difference. Like the forest was eroding not just their sense of direction, but their ability to understand each other, to recognize the basic human signals that separated people from animals, from objects. They needed to talk about Trevor, needed to decide if they should try climbing down, if they should search or move on. But Joel couldn't bring himself to start that conversation. Couldn't say the words that would make Trevor's disappearance real, permanent. So they sat in silence. The gray light around them stayed the same, never brighter, never darker. Time passed, or didn't. Trevor's absence shifted from fresh to familiar, just another part of their reality now, like the hunger, the thirst, the Starman's endless pursuit. Eventually, Garrett spoke. "We should sleep, save our energy." Joel wanted to argue, to say sleep was impossible, that they needed to stay alert. But instead, he found himself nodding, found himself lying down on the damp ground, closing his eyes while the others did the same. Sleep didn't come. Joel hovered somewhere between awake and unconscious, listening to the forest's lack of sound. No birds, no insects, no wind, just the occasional distant grinding of that voice calling his name with mechanical, patient repetition. His headache was worse. The pressure behind his eyes built to something almost unbearable. And with it came memories that didn't fit, images that felt familiar and wrong at the same time. He saw the ravine from above, saw four figures at the edge in that flat gray light, saw a rope fraying, saw equipment tumbling down, saw bodies falling into fog. But these weren't his memories. They couldn't be, because he'd been one of those figures. He'd been in the scene, not watching it. Unless something happened that his brain refused to accept. Something so devastating that his memory had shattered around it. Built false versions to shield him from a truth too terrible to hold. Joel sat up fast, heart slamming. Claire was watching him from a few feet away. She hadn't been sleeping either, had been staring at him with an intensity that felt like she'd been waiting for him to wake up, or acknowledge her, or say something she'd been expecting. "How long?" she asked quietly. Joel didn't need her to clarify. How long had they been in the forest? How long had they been walking in circles? How long had they been four people pretending not to notice they were becoming three? He couldn't answer. Days, a week. The timeline had completely dissolved, become as broken as the compass, as unreliable as every other tool they'd used to keep themselves oriented in a place designed to disorient. Claire kept staring, and Joel saw something in her face, something that might have been pity, or its opposite, some emotion he didn't have a word for. She knew something he didn't. She'd understood some fundamental truth about their situation that Joel was still avoiding. He wanted to ask, wanted to demand she tell him what she'd figured out. But before he could speak, the grinding started again. Much closer this time. Close enough that Joel felt it vibrating through the ground beneath him. Could sense the Starman's approach not just through sound, but through something deeper, something physical. They moved instantly, flattened themselves against the forest floor, went still as the trees. The light appeared seconds later, blinding, sweeping through their position with surgical precision. Joel held his breath as the beam passed over them once, twice, 3 times, each pass bringing heat and that grinding, automated voice. Joel, Claire, Garrett, not Trevor. The Starman didn't call Trevor's name. The omission hit Joel like a punch. Confirmation of something he'd been circling, something he'd been too afraid to name. The Starman knew. Whatever governed it, whatever intelligence controlled it, it knew Trevor was gone, knew exactly how many of them were left, knew the precise composition of their shrinking group. The light stayed overhead, too long, way too long. Joel's muscles screamed, his body locked in that unnatural stillness, cramping, protesting. His lungs burned with the need for a real breath instead of these shallow, controlled sips of air. He could sense Claire and Garrett beside him experiencing the same agony, their bodies starting to rebel, demanding movement, air, release from this excruciating tension. Joel was certain he couldn't hold it anymore. His body was about to betray him, to stand up regardless of what happened next. Then the light moved, swept toward the ravine, hovered there briefly, then receded into the depths of the forest. The grinding voice faded, then the echo faded, then nothing. They stayed frozen long after it was gone. No one dared move first, dared break whatever fragile protection their stillness had granted them. Finally, Joel pushed himself up, hands and knees first, then standing. His joints screamed, his muscles shook with exhaustion. Claire and Garrett rose slower, helping each other, moving carefully, deliberately. The fog had climbed to waist height. It swallowed the ground completely. Joel felt like he was wading through deep water now, each step a leap of faith that solid earth still existed beneath him, that he wouldn't suddenly drop through into some bottomless nothing. The sensation was worse than anything before, worse than losing his sense of direction, worse than the time distortions and memory gaps. This was something deeper, more fundamentally wrong. They needed to get away from the ravine, needed distance from that edge that kept pulling them back, no matter how hard they tried to escape. But which way? The fog erased everything, made the forest look identical in every direction. And Joel realized, with sinking dread, that he couldn't even pretend anymore, couldn't maintain the illusion of leadership when every choice led to the same result. "Where do we go?" Garrett asked. But Joel heard it differently, not as a question, as an accusation, a suggestion that Joel had failed, that his leadership had dragged them to this point, that maybe someone else making different choices would have found a way out where Joel had only found circles. He wanted to defend himself, to argue that no one could navigate this place, that the forest itself was designed to resist navigation, that escape was impossible by design. But the words died in his throat, wouldn't arrange themselves into anything coherent. Instead, he just pointed, picked a direction that felt fractionally different from the ones they'd tried before, and started walking. The others followed. That surprised him. He'd expected pushback, questions, demands for justification. But they fell into formation without a word. Garrett behind him, Claire at the back where Trevor used to be. 3 of them now. The number kept circling through Joel's head as they moved through the fog, as the forest pressed in around them, unchanged and unchanging. They'd started with 4, now there were 3. And the math pointed to an inevitable progression, a countdown toward some final number Joel didn't want to think about. His headache had shifted, evolved from dull pressure into something sharp and precise, centered behind his right eye, pulsing outward in rhythm with his heartbeat. And with each pulse came flashes. The ravine, the rope, bodies falling. The images had a terrible clarity, sharp and vivid in a way that contrasted brutally with the fog blanketing his memories of the first day, of how they'd arrived, of the choices that had led them here. He tried to focus on the images, to examine them directly, but they slipped away every time, only stayed visible in his peripheral awareness, at the edges of his mind where clarity broke down into suggestion and shadow. The forest was changing around them. Or maybe it had always been changing, and Joel was only noticing now. The trees grew tighter, closer together. Walking between them required turning sideways, required careful maneuvering to avoid getting scraped or snagged. The fog climbed higher, past waist height, up to his chest now. Joel couldn't see his own feet anymore, could only trust with each step that the ground was still there. Behind him he heard Claire struggling, her breathing labored, fighting through the narrow gaps. He turned to check on her, and couldn't see her. Just gray, thick, soupy gray that could have been hiding anything, anyone, nothing. "Claire," he called. His voice hit the fog and died, flattened, muffled, stripped of all power to carry. A response came, distant, smothered. Somewhere in the distance, proof she was still there, but nothing more. No sense of where she was or if she was okay. Joel waited for Garrett to answer too, to add his voice to hers. Silence. Just the forest, suffocating absence of sound. He called again, both their names. Nothing. The fog pressed in around him, warm and damp against his face, and Joel felt panic blooming in his chest, the kind that precedes total collapse. The moment when your mind gives up all pretense of control and dissolves into pure animal reaction. Then the Starman's voice cut through. From ahead, the direction they'd been walking. Joel knew what he was supposed to do. Press himself against the nearest tree. Stay hidden. Wait for it to pass. But instead he moved toward it, drawn by its familiarity, by the fact that it was at least something definite in a world that had become entirely shapeless. The light emerged slowly, first as a faint glow diffusing through the fog, then as a sharp, defined beam sweeping back and forth in its methodical search pattern. Joel watched from behind a thick pine, watched it carve through the forest in brutal clarity, casting shadows that moved wrong, that ignored their sources, that created angles and shapes that shouldn't exist. He should hide. Every encounter before had taught him that. Exposure meant capture, meant something worse than what they were already enduring, meant an ending he'd successfully avoided through caution and fear. But standing there, watching the light sweep closer, listening to that grinding voice call his name at perfect intervals, Joel felt something unexpected. Relief. A sense that maybe hiding had been the mistake, that what he needed wasn't to run, but to answer, to step into that light and let whatever was supposed to happen finally happen. His foot moved without permission. One step, then another, out from behind the tree, into the open where the light could reach him. The beam swept closer, called his name again. Joel. Joel. He stood waiting, arms at his sides, face turned upward toward the source of that blinding brilliance. The light found him, swept across him once, continued, then reversed. Settled. It bathed him in radiance so intense he could feel it pressing against his skin like a physical weight, Feel it penetrating through his clothes, into his body, illuminating him from the inside out. The grinding voice shifted. It wasn't saying his name anymore. Different words now, words that should have made sense, but the forest warped them, twisted them into something almost recognizable, something about coordinates, something about responding, words that might have been, "Do you require help?" or might have been something completely different, some language Joel had never studied but his body seemed to understand on a level deeper than thought. He opened his mouth to answer. He had no idea what he'd say. What words could possibly bridge the distance between himself and this thing that had been hunting them? But before any sound escaped, hands grabbed him from behind, yanked him backward, out of the light, into the fog and trees where the Starman couldn't reach. Claire and Garrett. They'd found him somehow, tracked him through the fog, pulled him away at the exact moment he was about to give in. They held him now between the trees, hands clamped over his mouth to keep him from calling out, from giving away their position. The light swept their location again, and again. The grinding voice called his name faster now, with something that might have been urgency or anger. Then slowly it pulled back. The light dimmed, the voice faded. They were left in the gray again. Joel fought against their grip, tried to break free, to get back to where the light had touched him. But they held firm. Eventually his resistance crumbled. Not from physical exhaustion, but from something deeper, a collapse of will, like the fundamental force that kept a person moving forward instead of just giving up had finally burned out. They released him slowly, carefully, like they weren't sure if he'd run the moment they let go. He didn't run, just stood there between them, swaying, trying to understand what had just happened. Why he'd felt that overwhelming pull toward the light. Why the Starman's voice had sounded less like a threat and more like an offer. Why everything about their situation felt increasingly, fundamentally wrong in ways he couldn't name. Claire was talking to him, urgently, her hands on his shoulders, her face close to his. But Joel couldn't understand the words, couldn't separate meaning from sound. Everything had blurred together. The line between communication and noise erased completely. He watched her mouth move, felt her breath on his skin, but understanding wouldn't come. The words were just noise now. Garrett joined in, added his voice to hers, and Joel grasped one thing clearly. They were scared of him. Something about his behavior had convinced them he was losing it, becoming a danger to whatever remained of their survival. The knowledge arrived flat, empty, just a fact that didn't require feeling or response. He tried to explain what he'd felt in the light, tried to describe the pull, the compulsion. But the words came out mangled, broken, and he saw it in their faces. He was failing. Couldn't bridge the gap between what he'd experienced and what they could understand. They stopped trying, just started walking again, this time with Joel between them, guiding him, like he'd become a liability, a wounded animal that might wander off and die if left unsupervised. Joel didn't argue. Let them direct him through the fog, through the unchanging forest. Time passed, how much he couldn't tell. The gray light stayed the same. The fog held at chest height. The trees kept their impossible angles. His headache wasn't pulsing anymore. It had settled into something permanent, a steady pressure that made thinking hard, made memory almost impossible. They found the cache by accident. Garrett tripped over something buried in the fog. A package wrapped in what looked like Joel's own jacket. tied with cord that matched their lost climbing rope. Inside, water bottles, trail mix, the emergency radio they'd lost on day one. Joel stared, tried to make sense of it, to fit this into the story he'd built in his head about sabotage, about someone systematically destroying their supplies. The radio's battery cover hung open, batteries scattered in the dirt. The water bottles had been opened, emptied. The trail mix dumped out, attracting nothing because nothing lived in this forest to be attracted. Garrett picked up the radio. His hands shook as he examined it. "Who did this?" he asked. "Who took our stuff and destroyed it and buried it here?" But the question wasn't really a question. It carried something else, a certainty beginning to form. Forming. A horrible understanding he was asking about just to postpone the moment he'd have to admit what he already knew. Claire said nothing. She stood separate from them, staring into the fog with fierce concentration. Joel followed her gaze but saw nothing, just gray emptiness. Then he got it. She wasn't looking at something. She was looking for something. For Trevor, who'd gone over the edge. For whoever had been sabotaging them. For some outside enemy they could blame so they wouldn't have to face the alternative. Wouldn't have to consider that the danger came from inside, from themselves. The grinding voice started again. Closer than it had ever been. So close Joel was certain the Starman was directly above them, just beyond the canopy. Its burning face turned down toward them. Voice calling their names with mechanical, patient repetition. But this time, nobody hid. Garrett kept turning the broken radio over in his hands like staring at it long enough would make it work again. Claire kept her eyes locked on the fog, and Joel just stood there between them while his headache climbed toward something unbearable. Like his skull was about to crack open and spill whatever truth he'd been keeping locked inside. The light came. Not gradually, instantly. A pillar of brilliance that punched straight through the fog like it wasn't even there, bathing them in ruthless clarity. Joel looked up and didn't see the Starman's face. He saw something else, something mechanical, purposeful. Something that rotated slowly in the air above them with steady, automated precision. The grinding voice spoke, said his name clearly, distinctly. And beneath the amplified distortion, Joel heard something familiar, something that might have been human, that might have been trying to reach him across some impossible distance. Response required, the voice said. The words came through clearly now. No grinding, no distortion. Confirm your position. Confirm you can hear this transmission. Joel opened his mouth, ready to respond, to confirm, to accept whatever was being offered. Garrett moved, grabbed his arm, pulled him back toward the trees where the light couldn't reach. Claire grabbed his other arm. Together they dragged him away from the light, away from the voice, away from whatever was trying to make contact. They ran. Joel let himself be pulled, his feet catching on roots and stones invisible beneath the fog, his body offering no resistance as they hauled him deeper into the forest. Behind them, the light swept frantically, the voice calling his name faster now, with something unmistakable in it. Concern, urgency, fear. They ran until the light died behind them, until the voice faded completely, until they collapsed in a tangled heap at the base of an enormous pine whose trunk bent in 3 separate directions like it had been growing sideways, then up, then sideways again for its entire life. Joel lay on his back, gasping, staring up through the branches at the colorless sky. His headache crested, then suddenly broke. left behind a strange, terrible clarity, like some wall in his mind had finally crumbled, let through thoughts and memories that had been locked out. He saw the ravine, four figures at its edge, saw the rope fraying, not from wear, from cutting, saw his own hand holding the knife, sawing through fiber after fiber while the others argued about roots, about whether to climb down or find another way. Saw the rope give, saw three bodies fall, saw himself standing alone at the edge, staring down into fog that swallowed everything. No, that couldn't be right. The memory was wrong. A hallucination his broken mind had constructed to explain something simpler, something more bearable. But what was simpler than an accident? What truth could be easier to carry than equipment failure, than loss that came through no one's fault? Joel sat up slowly, looked for the others, found Claire slumped against a tree 10 feet away, eyes closed, breathing shallow and steady. Found Garrett lying face down in the fog, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his back. Found no one else, just the two of them, and himself, and the forest pressing in. Three people who'd been four, who might have been more before that, whose number kept shrinking with each day, each hour, each minute in this place where time had stopped making sense. Joel stood carefully, quietly, trying not to wake the others. He needed to check something, needed to confirm a suspicion that had been building since they found the cache, since he'd seen the destroyed supplies that he'd destroyed during one of the fugue states, the blackouts that came more and more frequently, the episodes where he lost chunks of time and found himself somewhere else with no memory of how he got there. He walked away from their resting spot, moving carefully through the fog, counting steps to keep his bearings. 20 paces north, or what he decided was north. 30 paces east. 20 paces south. That should have brought him back, should have returned him to where Claire and Garrett lay sleeping. Instead, he found the ravine. It appeared suddenly, its edge materializing out of the fog with no warning. Joel stood at the drop, staring down into the gray void that hid whatever was at the bottom. He called into it. Trevor. Called it 3 times. Listened for a response that didn't come. That had never come. That would never come. Because Trevor wasn't down there waiting to be rescued, wasn't injured and unable to climb back up. Trevor couldn't respond because he'd never fallen. Or he had fallen, but not alone. Had fallen with the others when the rope gave way, when Joel's sabotage worked, when the plan Joel didn't remember making came to completion. No, still not right, still not the whole truth. But he was getting closer, could feel it like heat from a fire he was walking toward in total darkness. He moved along the ravine's edge, trailing his hand against the rock face, feeling cold stone beneath his palm. The rope still hung over the side. He could see it now through the thinning fog, could see how it ended, not in frayed, broken strands, in clean cuts. From a blade, from the knife at his belt, the one with its blade snapped in half from repeated use. Voices behind him. Garrett and Claire, arguing about something. Words unclear but tone unmistakable, harsh, accusatory. The sound of people who'd abandoned all pretense of civility and descended into pure blame. Joel turned toward the sound, started walking back to where he'd left them, retracing his steps. But when he reached the spot, he found nothing. Just undisturbed forest, trees and fog and that endless gray light that never changed. No sign anyone had rested there. No flattened grass. No disturbed earth. Nothing to prove human beings had ever been there except Joel's own footprints in the damp soil. A single set of tracks, beginning nowhere, leading nowhere. The voices continued, shifted location as he turned, always just out of sight, just beyond the fog's veil. He called to them. They didn't respond, kept arguing like he hadn't spoken, like he wasn't there, like he existed in some overlapping space that let him hear them but not touch them. He started walking again. Stopped trying to follow the voices. Stopped trying to navigate or orient himself. The forest would take him where it wanted. The Starman would find him when it was ready. The ravine would open beneath his feet at the right moment. And he'd fall or not fall. It was out of his hands now. The light found him while he was walking. Swept through the trees ahead, moving toward him with clear intention, clear purpose. Joel didn't run, didn't hide. Just kept walking toward it like he'd been doing all along. The voice called his name. Clearly now, no electronic grinding, just a human voice, amplified, projected across distance. We have your location. Stay where you are. Help is coming. Help. The word felt foreign, like it belonged to a different language, a different context Joel had forgotten when he entered this forest. Or maybe long before that, maybe years ago, when events he couldn't quite remember set him on a path that led inevitably here, to this moment, standing in gray fog while a light searched for him and a voice promised assistance he couldn't comprehend anymore. He kept walking toward the light. It grew brighter as he approached, from diffused glow to focused beam to overwhelming radiance that made his eyes water and his skin burn with heat. But he didn't stop, didn't turn away. Walked directly into it and through it, and discovered on the other side, not the Starman's burning face, something. Joel spun back toward the sound of their argument, started retracing his path, step by step, back to where he'd left them resting. When he arrived, the forest was empty. No bodies slumped against trees, no disturbed ground, no bent grass, just silence and fog and that unchanging pallor of gray light filtering down. The only proof anyone had been there at all was a single line of footprints pressed into the wet earth. His own. They started from nothing, ended at nothing. The voices kept going, but they moved when he did, always behind the fog, always just out of reach. Claire Garrett. They didn't hear him, or didn't care. The argument continued unbroken, like Joel was a ghost passing through their world without ever touching it. He stopped chasing, stopped trying to make sense of direction or distance or anything else. Whatever this place was, it would deliver him where it wanted him. The thing with the light would come when it decided. The ground would vanish beneath him when the moment was right. He had no say in it anymore. That's when the light returned, cutting through the trees in front of him, deliberate, direct, coming straight for him. Joel didn't flinch, didn't hide behind a tree or press himself into the dirt. Just kept walking, same pace, same direction. The voice cut through the air. His name clean and clear. No mechanical distortion, just someone human calling from a distance. We've located you, do not move. Extraction inbound. Extraction. The word hung in Joel's mind like something from a dream. A piece of vocabulary that didn't belong to the world he was standing in. Maybe didn't belong to him at all anymore. Maybe it never had. Maybe whatever choices led him here started long before the forest, long before he could even remember making them. He kept moving toward the brilliance. It intensified as the gap closed, from soft glow to searing column. Heat radiated off it in waves. His eyes watered. His skin felt like it was blistering. He didn't slow down. Walked straight into the heart of it, let it swallow him whole. And when he emerged on the other side, it wasn't the star man waiting for him. It was real. A clearing, scorched earth. No grass, no undergrowth, just bare ground marked with burn patterns radiating outward in perfect circles. The trees at the edge stood in unnaturally straight lines, not grown, planted. The fog thinned where the light touched it, not fog at all, steam or smoke, something rising where heat met cold in exact ratios. And at the center of it all, a basket metal frame, someone inside wearing bright orange, leaning out, hand extended. Behind Joel, voices erupted, screaming, begging him to stop, to turn back, to not take another step. He didn't stop. Moved toward the basket, toward the figure reaching for him, toward the promise of an ending. Footsteps pounded behind him, his companions rushing out of the trees to grab him, to pull him away, to save him from making this final, fatal mistake. Joel turned to explain, to tell them why he had to go, why hiding was over, why the light wasn't what they thought it was. But when he looked back, nothing, just forest, fog, gray light. The footsteps stopped, the voices cut off mid-scream. Joel stood alone in the clearing, hands stretched toward empty air, mouth open to speak to people who weren't there, who had never been there, who existed only in the shattered landscape of his mind. He looked down at his hand. It was shaking, dirt packed black under every nail. Scratches crisscrossed his palms, cuts that looked like he'd been clawing at something, digging, moving earth for reasons he couldn't remember. His clothes were destroyed, filthy beyond what any hike could explain, torn, stained with substances he couldn't identify and didn't want to. The basket waited. The figure in orange kept calling, using his name, using other words that should have made sense, that should have meant something. But the meaning wouldn't connect, like there was a gap between the sound and his understanding that conscious thought couldn't cross. Movement behind him, in the forest. Not his companions. Something else. Something he'd been carrying. Something he needed to protect, needed to bring to safety before he could let himself be saved. Joel turned back toward the trees, toward the movement, and saw them through the gray. 3 shapes, motionless, standing in the shadows. Joel moved toward them without thinking. His friends, his responsibility, the people he'd sworn to get home safe. Claire, Garrett, Trevor, all 3 waiting for him in the shadows. He couldn't leave them behind, couldn't climb into that basket and rise into the sky while they stayed trapped here, while that burning thing kept hunting them, while they starved in this endless gray twilight. The voice behind him escalated to a shout. Joel, stop. There's nobody there. You're alone. Please listen to me. But that was insane. He could see them, right there, between the trees, waiting for him to come back, to lead them, to protect them from the light. Joel reached the first figure, put his hand on a shoulder, felt fabric, felt the weight of a body underneath, felt warmth that meant life, that meant reality, that meant these weren't ghosts or hallucinations, but real people who needed real help. The figure didn't react to his touch, didn't turn, didn't speak, just stood there staring forward into nothing. Joel moved to the second, then the third, touched each one, confirmed they were solid, real, alive. Then he started pulling, dragging them away from the clearing, away from the basket and the light, and the lies about rescue that would separate him from the people depending on him. They moved reluctantly, feet dragging through the dirt, bodies heavy and resistant but not fighting back. Joel pulled harder, used everything he had left to haul them deeper into the forest, into the fog, into the shadows where the light couldn't follow, where they'd be safe. He found a hollow beneath the roots of a massive fallen tree, a shelter dark and hidden. One by one, he dragged them inside, arranged them carefully in the blackness, positioned them where the hunter would never look, where they could wait out the search, where they could survive until the thing with the burning face gave up and left. Joel sealed the entrance with branches and dirt, made it perfect, made it invisible. The basket and the voice and the light couldn't reach them now. He'd outsmarted the trap, saved them all from whatever waited in that machine. In the darkness of their shelter, Joel sat with his back against cold earth. Outside, the voice kept calling, his name over and over, getting quieter, more distant, more desperate. Then the sound of the machine changed pitch, lifted, rose into the sky, and left. The forest went silent. No grinding mechanical voice, no sweeping light, no rotating blades cutting through air. Just stillness, fog, that eternal gray glow filtering down through roots and soil. Joel reached out in the dark, found hands, held them tight. His friends still here, still safe. He hadn't failed them. The headache that had been splitting his skull for days finally started to ease, like some enormous decision had been made, and the making of it brought relief, regardless of what came next. He waited for morning, for rescue, for the hunter to return, for anything to break the suffocating quiet that had settled over them like a burial shroud. His fingers registered something strange, a texture he hadn't noticed before. Not warm cloth over living skin, something else, something that gave when he pressed it, that didn't spring back, that felt cold and soft in ways flesh shouldn't feel. The observation arrived without panic, without shock, just another detail to file away, to think about later when his mind cleared enough to process what it meant about his situation, about his companions, about the 8 days he'd spent walking in circles while a voice called his name, and a light searched patiently for whatever was left of the person he'd been before the rope snapped, before the accident, before whatever happened cracked something fundamental inside him and let the forest seep into the broken places. Joel sat in the dark, hands wrapped around theirs, listening to nothing, waiting for the gray light to shift, to brighten or dim, to give some signal that time was still moving, that transition was possible, that lost could become found, that one story could end and another begin. But the light stayed exactly the same, gray, constant, refusing to resolve into anything recognizable as day or night. And in that unchanging glow, Joel gripped what he'd rescued, what he'd protected from the burning hunter, the friends who'd never leave him now, who'd stay with him forever in this place that didn't release what it caught, that just held and held and held, until holding and being held became the same thing, until protector and protected were indistinguishable, until there was nothing left but forest and fog and gray light that wouldn't shift and wouldn't stop and wouldn't ever, ever end.